In 2009, Blackmagic Design bought a dyeing color grading system that cost $800,000 and had fewer than 1,000 users worldwide. Today, that same software is free, and it is Adobe's worst nightmare. That reaction, a company giving away for free what used to cost nearly $1 million, tells you something important. This isn't a story about software. It's a story about a deliberate, calculated dismantling of the most powerful creative monopoly in the world, and buried inside it is a strategy so simple, so obvious in hindsight, that it makes Adobe's response look like a slow-motion catastrophe. Let's go back to 2009. In 2009, Adobe was untouchable. Creative Cloud didn't exist yet, but Adobe's grip on the creative industry was already absolute. Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, Premiere Pro. If you worked in film, television, advertising, or design, you paid Adobe. There was no real alternative. There was no conversation to be had. You opened your wallet, and you kept it open. Premiere Pro had been the industry standard for video editing since the early 2000s. Hollywood editors used it, broadcast networks used it. YouTube didn't exist yet at scale, but when it did, the first generation of creators who took it seriously reached for Premiere Pro by default, because that's what the professionals used and that's what the schools taught. Adobe's business model at the time was straightforward: sell expensive perpetual licenses. Premiere Pro cost hundreds of dollars per copy. The full Creative Suite, the bundle that included everything, cost over $2,500 for a single license. It was expensive, it was inaccessible, and it didn't matter because there was nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, in a completely different corner of the industry, a piece of software called DaVinci Resolve existed, but barely. It wasn't a competitor to Premiere Pro. It wasn't even in the same conversation. DaVinci Resolve was a color grading system, not an editing tool, not a production suite, a color grading system, and it was owned by a company called DaVinci Systems, which sold it as a hardware-software bundle that cost between $200,000 and $800,000 per installation. You read that correctly, $800,000 for a color grading system. The clients who could afford it were major Hollywood studios, high-end post-production houses, and broadcast networks with infrastructure budgets that most people couldn't imagine. The average filmmaker had never heard of it. The average editor had never touched it. It was a tool for a world that existed behind closed doors. And then, in 2009, a small Australian hardware company called Blackmagic Design bought DaVinci Systems. The price of the acquisition was never publicly disclosed. What happened next changed the industry. Grant Petty, Blackmagic's CEO, looked at what he had just purchased, an $800,000 system with a tiny elite user base, and made a decision that the entire industry thought was insane. He was going to give it away for free. What Adobe didn't see coming was how much that single decision would cost them. In June 2011, Blackmagic Design released DaVinci Resolve 8 Lite, free. No subscription, no trial period, no watermark on the output, free. The industry reacted with confusion more than alarm. Color grading tools had always been expensive. The idea that a professional grade system, even a stripped-down version of one, could be free didn't compute. Most people assumed it was a marketing stunt, a loss leader, something that would quietly disappear in 18 months when the numbers didn't work. Adobe didn't panic. Why would they? DaVinci Resolve was a color grading tool. Premiere Pro was a full editing suite. They weren't competing for the same user. Adobe's subscription model was still years away. The company was printing money on perpetual licenses. A free color grading tool from a hardware company in Australia was not a threat. It was a curiosity. What Adobe missed, what almost everyone missed, was that Grant Petty wasn't building a color grading tool. He was building a Trojan horse. Between 2011 and 2014, Blackmagic quietly added editing capabilities to DaVinci Resolve. Not basic editing, real editing, timeline editing, multi-track audio, the kind of editing that Premiere Pro users did every single day, and they kept it free. Then in 2014, Adobe made a decision that would, in hindsight, be the single greatest gift it ever gave to Blackmagic Design. Adobe killed the perpetual license. On May 6, 2013, Adobe announced Creative Cloud, a subscription-only model that would replace the one-time purchase system entirely. By 2014, if you wanted Premiere Pro, you didn't buy it. You rented it every month, forever. Cancel the subscription, lose access to your software. The backlash was immediate. Reddit threads flooded with outrage. Petitions circulated. Longtime Adobe users who had paid thousands of dollars for perpetual licenses felt the ground shift beneath them. They had owned their tools. Now they were tenants. And right there, in that moment of maximum user frustration, DaVinci Resolve was sitting in the corner, free, increasingly capable, and getting better every single month. The crack in Adobe's empire had just appeared, and it was wider than anyone realized. Adobe's subscription model wasn't just unpopular. The math behind it was about to become a trap. Adobe's Creative Cloud strategy worked. Financially, it worked spectacularly. Revenue that had been lumpy and unpredictable, tied to major version releases every 18 months, became smooth, recurring, and compounding. By fiscal 2024, Adobe's creative segment alone generated nearly $12.7 billion in annual revenue. Industry estimates placed Creative Cloud's paid subscriber base at roughly 37 million, a figure Adobe itself does not officially disclose, reporting revenue rather than headcount, numbers that would make any CFO weep with joy. But the subscription model did something else, something Adobe's financial models didn't fully account for. It changed the psychological relationship between Adobe and its users. When you buy software, you own it. The company has to earn your upgrade. When you subscribe to software, you're in a permanent negotiation. Every month you're asking yourself, is this still worth it? And every time Adobe raised prices in 2018, in 2022, in 2023, that question got louder. The 2022 increase was modest on paper. By that point, the All Apps plan had reached $82.49 per month for annual subscribers, less than $2 more than before. But it wasn't the amount, it was the signal. Adobe was a landlord now, and landlords raise rent. Meanwhile, DaVinci Resolve Studio, the paid professional version of Resolve, costs $295. One time, not per month, not per year, $295 once, and you owned it forever. Every update included, every new feature included, no subscription, no renewal, no negotiation. The contrast was not subtle. Adobe was charging nearly $660 per year for Premiere Pro alone. DaVinci Resolve Studio was $295 for life. By January 2019, DaVinci Resolve had already crossed 2 million users on the free version alone. Blackmagic has not published an updated figure since, which, given the growth trajectory, may be a deliberate choice. Film schools that had taught Premiere Pro for a decade started switching curricula. YouTube creators who had started on Premiere Pro started migrating, not because DaVinci Resolve was necessarily better in every category, but because the price difference was impossible to ignore. And then Adobe did something that accelerated the exodus in a way no competitor could have engineered. In April 2024, Adobe announced Firefly, its generative AI model, rolling out directly inside Premiere Pro. 2 months later, in June 2024, an update to Adobe's terms of service triggered a separate wave of panic. The language was vague. It suggested, or appeared to suggest, that Adobe could access user content for machine learning purposes. The internet did not react calmly. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse for Adobe, the $20 billion bet they made to secure their future collapsed in a single afternoon. On September 15, 2022, Adobe announced it would acquire Figma, the dominant collaborative design tool, for $20 billion. It was the largest acquisition in Adobe's history, by a significant margin. The strategic logic was clear. Figma had done to Adobe's design tools what DaVinci Resolve was doing to Premiere Pro. It had built a better, more accessible product and taken the next generation of users before Adobe could reach them. Figma's user base was younger, faster growing, and deeply loyal. Buying Figma meant buying the future of design. What Adobe didn't fully model was the regulatory environment. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority investigated and concluded the deal would kill competition in the design software market. The European Commission raised parallel concerns. Under combined regulatory pressure from the UK, the EU, and scrutiny from US enforcers, Adobe and Figma jointly agreed to terminate the transaction in December 2023. Adobe paid Figma a $1 billion breakup fee, $1 billion, for a deal that never happened. The market's reaction was not forgiving. Adobe's stock continued to decline through 2024, losing roughly 40% of its value over that year, a collapse that coincided almost exactly with the Figma breakup fee and growing concerns about AI competition eroding the Creative Cloud moat. The company that had spent $20 billion trying to acquire its way into the future had instead spent $1 billion to confirm it had no clear path there. And while Adobe was navigating regulatory collapse and investor panic, DaVinci Resolve was doing something quietly devastating. It was showing up on Hollywood feature films. Blackmagic Design had positioned DaVinci Resolve not just as a free tool for beginners, but as the professional standard for color grading on major productions. The same software that a 17-year-old YouTube creator could download for free on a Tuesday afternoon was being used in post-production pipelines for major studio releases. The same software, the same license, free or $295. Adobe had spent decades building the perception that professional tools required professional prices. Blackmagic had just proven that the perception was the product, and the product itself could be free. The attack didn't come from a software company. It came from a hardware company that understood something Adobe never did. Grant Petty's insight was not about software. It was about ecosystems. Blackmagic Design's core business was, and remains, professional video hardware. Capture cards, switchers, cameras, the Ursa Mini Pro, the Pocket Cinema camera, hardware that professional filmmakers and broadcast engineers buy once and use for years, hardware with real margins, hardware that doesn't require a monthly subscription to keep working. DaVinci Resolve was never meant to be a profit center on its own. It was meant to be the reason you bought Blackmagic hardware. If you learned DaVinci Resolve, if your entire post-production workflow was built around it, then when you needed a new camera, a new capture card, a new switcher, you looked at Blackmagic first. The software was the lock-in. The hardware was the revenue. It was a business model Adobe structurally could not copy. Adobe doesn't make cameras. Adobe doesn't make capture cards. Adobe's entire revenue model depends on software subscriptions. If Adobe made Premiere Pro free, it would destroy its own business. If Adobe dropped the price to $295 for a lifetime license, it would destroy its own business. The subscription model that had generated nearly $12.7 billion in creative revenue in fiscal 2024 was also the cage it couldn't escape. Petty had described his philosophy explicitly. Blackmagic wasn't playing by the same rules. They weren't trying to extract maximum revenue from each user. They were trying to maximize the number of users who were deeply embedded in the Blackmagic ecosystem. Free software was not a cost. It was the most efficient marketing spend in the history of the industry. By 2024, estimates placed Adobe Premiere Pro at approximately 35% of the video editing software market, DaVinci Resolve near 15%, and Final Cut Pro around 25%, a split that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The numbers alone don't capture the trajectory. Premiere Pro's share was declining, Resolve's was growing, and the demographic breakdown was even more alarming for Adobe. Among creators under 30, DaVinci Resolve's adoption rate was disproportionately high. The next generation of professional editors was learning on Resolve, not Premiere. Adobe had spent years building the most powerful creative software ecosystem in the world, and a hardware company from Australia had found the one attack vector Adobe's entire business model made it impossible to defend against: price zero. And that's where Adobe's final move made everything worse. Adobe's answer to DaVinci Resolve was artificial intelligence. In April 2024, Adobe rolled out Firefly inside Premiere Pro, Generative Extend, text-to-video, AI object removal, B-roll generation from text prompts. The pitch was clear. Adobe wasn't just a subscription. Adobe was an AI-powered creative platform. The future of editing wasn't cutting clips on a timeline. It was describing what you wanted and letting the machine build it. The creative community did not respond with enthusiasm. The backlash came from two directions simultaneously. Working editors and filmmakers worried that AI-generated content would devalue their skills and replace their jobs. Then, in June 2024, the Terms of Service update arrived. Creators who stored client work inside Adobe's ecosystem panicked. The language suggested, or appeared to suggest, that Adobe could use their files to train its models. Adobe clarified publicly, Firefly was trained only on licensed Adobe stock content and public domain material, not on customer files. The clarification came. The trust did not fully return. DaVinci Resolve, meanwhile, had also been adding AI features, noise reduction, speed warp, magic mask, voice isolation. but framed them as tools that enhanced the editor's control rather than replaced it. The positioning was different. The trust was different. The man who built DaVinci Resolve into Adobe's worst nightmare did it by doing the opposite of everything Adobe did. Adobe raised prices. Blackmagic lowered them to zero. Adobe locked users into subscriptions. Blackmagic offered a one-time license. Adobe tried to acquire its way into the future and paid $1 billion for the privilege of failing. Blackmagic built its future by giving its most powerful tool away for free. Adobe spent decades building the most profitable creative software company in the world. It generated nearly $12.7 billion in creative revenue in a single fiscal year. It had tens of millions of paying subscribers. It had the brand, the distribution, the enterprise relationships, and the institutional inertia of an entire industry trained on its products. And a hardware company from Australia with a free download and a $295 lifetime license is slowly, methodically, one film school curriculum at a time, taking it apart. The question was never whether DaVinci Resolve could beat Adobe, it was whether Adobe could change fast enough to stop it.